Hello, my name is Matthias Goertz, and I'm sharing with you my monthly COVID-19 update. As always, to do so, I will share my screen with you. The headline today is "I Can't Breathe," which is an invitation to myself and to all of you to take a short moment to settle in, relax, get ready, and take a few deep breaths. And welcome. This is called Anapanasati, mindfulness of breathing. It's, of course, a mini version, but I hope you feel mindful now and ready. So let's start. I've previously shared the COVID-19 scenarios. I've been tracking since April. As of December, we continue to be deep into what we call the fractured world, which is a world in which the severity of COVID-19 has turned out to be rather moderate. And the effectiveness of the global response has turned out to be rather ineffective, which I pointed out before is a rather paradoxical world we are in. In fact, if you had asked me in March when we designed these scenarios, I would have thought this world is almost implausible. Should we even have it in our scenarios? Because scenarios always must be plausible. I could not really imagine at that time that this could happen. So already a learning there, anything can happen. Excuse me. Now, as always, let me just give you quick updates on the two axes that frame these scenarios. So why are we saying the severity of COVID-19 is moderate, and why are we saying the global response is ineffective? Firstly, in terms of the severity of COVID-19, I've shared this slide before, just as a reminder. 100% of us will eventually be infected with this virus, just as we are with other common cold viruses. So that will be a completely ordinary thing and will happen repeatedly to our best knowledge at the moment. Once we've been infected a first time, our immune system will build a memory of this virus and will henceforth in future encounters with the virus, we will be repeatedly encountering the virus and we'll be repeatedly infected. But our immune system will be so well prepared that it's extremely unlikely after the first infection that we would ever get severely sick from this virus, which is exactly the same as any other common cold virus. So whether, I said this before, whether experts will eventually categorize this virus as a common cold coronavirus or not, it behaves like one. And that's the key to us, right? For all we know, it just behaves just like any other common cold coronavirus, which is very good news because it means essentially once we are through this first encounter, which is problematic merely because the virus is new to our immune systems and about 1% of humanity appear to have problems dealing with this new virus appropriately because their immune system is in some way or another compromised. For the other 99%, this virus is unproblematic already today. But even for those 1% who have a problem, if they overcome the first encounter and do not pass away, which sadly, of course, several million of us are, but the majority are not. And it's important to keep in mind, even of those 1% whose immune system has trouble with this virus, the vast majority survive that encounter. And we can expect that they will basically never have a problem again. Now, that we'll have exceptions, like any good rule, but as a rule, once they're over the first time, their immune system will have been able to somehow build a memory of this virus and be better prepared the next time. So we'll all get this virus. We will get it repeatedly. We will, sooner or later, we will just stop tracking that because it's meaningless. We are not tracking the other 200 plus common cold viruses that we're exposed to either, right? For good reason. We don't need to track them because they are by and large completely harmless. They cause some irritation when we have a cold, but that's it. So the same will happen here. So this 100% penetration, you might say, well, but isn't that awful? No, that's actually a good sign in a way. That means it's a virus that will be very well adapted to us. The virus has no interest in killing its host, and it won't, basically. So we are just now in this tricky sort of first encounter where our immune system has to learn to deal with the virus. The virus is, of course, mutating and it's trying to adapt to us humans because it came from some other mammal, probably, which is similar enough to us so that the virus could jump over, but it still is different enough for the virus to have to go through their own adaptation to the new host. And viruses are very fast, especially if they're spreading quickly like this one, relatively quickly. Viruses are fast to adapt, apparently faster than our brains, which are taking rather longer to adapt to this virus. But eventually, our immune systems, of course, they can only adapt to it once they've been exposed to it. Right? Now, the shortcut to this adaptation is the vaccines. The vaccines mimic aspects, the most important aspects of the virus, typically the way the virus docks onto our cells. So the vaccine in one way or another mimic that and thereby encourage and trigger the immune system to create an immune response without actually having been exposed to the real virus. It's sort of the vaccine is a dummy virus, or a pseudovirus, or a model of that virus, or a fragment of that virus. Whatever it is, it triggers the immune system to have the right response. And when then the real virus comes, the immune system is ready, right? And our current understanding is that the immune system is so ready for at least a few months, if not maybe a year or two, that the virus may not even infect you during that time. But then eventually that effect goes down because this being a harmless virus, I said this before, our immune system has no incentive to keep antibodies in the blood. Antibodies are the sort of the first defense. They basically prevent a virus from entering into our body. That's the main function, if you like. They also prevent it from getting further down, as I talked about. But first of all, they try to prevent the virus from entering at all, rather from being able to infect us and create a colony and colonize us, right? So for a while, the immunization that you receive, either by being infected by the real thing or by being infected by the dummy, the vaccine, will probably protect you even from the infection as such. But after a few months or a couple of years, that will go away, and you will be again susceptible to being reinfected, unless, of course, you then get another vaccination and another vaccine. So maybe every 1 or 2 years, people will be called upon, if you want to protect yourself against infection, please get the vaccine. My projection is it will not be necessary because once you've had it once, your immune system is basically trained, and every time it is exposed to the virus, it will protect you in terms of you're not getting severely ill. So what will happen, I think, my prognosis is that we will repeatedly get infected by this virus, just as we are by other common cold viruses. But our immune system will be effective, not at the level of where the virus enters our upper respiratory system, because it's too expensive for our immune system to maintain all these antibodies in the blood. For a virus that's basically harmless. I mean, our immune system is probably very, very efficient and effective in terms of making choices as to how to spend energy, right? And this virus is not going to be worth its energy to keep up antibody production, at all times. It's just not worth it, right? Because it's harmless. Yeah. However, it's not harmless if it gets into our lower respiratory system. So what the immune system would rationally, and not that the immune system has a rationality, but it behaves as if it does, sometimes apparently more than our brain, which often behaves rather irrationally. Right? The immune system will just figure out that, okay, virus getting up here into the upper respiratory system, no problem. Virus getting down here into the lower respiratory system, a potential big problem. So what it will do is it will have enough memory of the virus that it will allow to colonize the upper respiratory system, but not to get any further. That's anyways what we've observed with all the common cold viruses. So that, to me, the common cold viruses are just, whether this is a common cold virus or not by any kind of technical definition, the common cold virus is the model, right? My anticipation is that this virus behaves just like any common cold virus. And what we are seeing there is that they repeatedly infect us, but they don't get any further than here. And up here in the upper respiratory system, they can't do any damage. I mean, we'll have a headache, we'll have a cough, we'll have a running nose, all those slight symptoms of a cold, right? And this virus, I predict, will be no different, right? So that's why even when we say 100% of us will get it, the severity is moderate. In fact, one could say the severity after this initial encounter will be negligible. In a few years' time, nobody will think about this virus anymore, is my prediction. Right? Yesterday, BBC interviewed someone from the World Health Organization. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to catch the name. It was some professor who was musing about, we could be in this for years, and I can't even anticipate even in so many years that 100,000 people would get together into a stadium. And I was just sitting there and saying, well, why? I mean, the other few hundred common cold viruses are not preventing us from getting together in a stadium with 100,000 people. I just don't know why people make these statements in public on the BBC, obviously without having thought about what this virus is. They have no model. Apparently, this professor, I don't know what he is professor of, but he apparently has no model in his mind of this virus. Right? Well, as a philosopher, you're trying to categorize or to describe this phenomenon, right? This is a phenomenon, and you try to get your head around it. And so the way I do that is I'm saying this is basically just another common cold coronavirus, right? I've been saying that for a while, just to repeat that, right? And if you have that mental model, then a lot of things fall in place. This is why this and this happened. Yeah, it's seasonal. Of course it's seasonal. It's a common cold coronavirus, like all common cold coronaviruses and all flu viruses and all other common cold viruses, the rhinoviruses, of which we have 200 or more. They're all seasonal, right? So yeah, once you have that mental model, you say, yeah, of course this will be seasonal. I mean, in fact, I said that, I don't know, April or May already, that it will be seasonal, right? You need to have a mental model. Now you could say, well, Matthias, what if your mental model is wrong? Yeah, no, that's a good point. You have to challenge it at all times. I challenge my mental model like almost every day. But hey, I've been at this for over 6 months now, and there's been nothing undermining my mental model. You could call it a hypothesis if you like, and this hypothesis is just getting stronger by the day. Okay, so yeah, but of course, please challenge my hypothesis by all means. That's why I'm putting it up, right? If you have a different mental model of this virus, well, share it, right? I'm just saying I have a feeling that a vast majority of those people who are in the public domain and who are being interviewed on public channels and who are the ones who are the thought leaders without really thinking, but let's call them the thought leaders on this matter, none of them have a mental model of this, what this virus is actually about. Right? And this is now 9 months into this affair, so that's rather disturbing. Now, this is just my perception. Maybe they would say, no, we have a mental model, and ours is just different than yours, Matthias, and you're not listening to us. But I'm trying to listen very careful. I listen to more about this stuff than probably most people on this planet, and I just don't see them having a concept of this virus other than this is dangerous. We have to fight it. We are at war. Which is not a concept, which is like a sign of helplessness, and I mean intellectual helplessness, to be quite frank. Right? Okay, so 100% of us will get it. And yeah, by the way, the vaccines will not change that really. I mean, they could in theory, and they may in a few cases. As I said, I mean, after a few months or a couple of years, we need to expect that the effect of the vaccination or the effect of the initial infection, either way, tapers off in the sense that the body no longer produces antibodies in the blood. And that probably means we are susceptible again for being reinfected. So, the virus will get back into our upper respiratory system, right? So, so we will all get it eventually, even those of us who either already had it or who are benefiting from the vaccination, right? I'll talk about vaccination later on. So hopefully over the next 2-3 quarters, those people who are at risk, as it is called, will obtain this vaccine, will be vaccinated. And so they are probably protected from an infection for some time, but eventually that tapers off. And unless they then get re-vaccinated, they will eventually catch the virus anyways, right? Now, it will be harmless to them by that time, because once they had the vaccination, my prediction, as I said, the immune system will be ready. So when they then get infected later on, it will be harmless. Yeah. So the vaccine will be very helpful, but it doesn't prevent 100% of us, or it doesn't prevent any of us from actually being infected eventually. It's inevitable, is I guess what I'm saying. It's inevitable, and there may be a few exceptions, but maybe not all of us have all 200 plus common cold viruses, right? I can imagine there will be exceptions. Not all of us get all the influenza strains in the course of our life. Some of us are just by coincidence not exposed to a few of these, but I would think that most of us have most of those things at some point in our life. And so most of us, and I mean 99-point-something% of us, will get this virus eventually. Yeah. But it doesn't matter. That's the point. That's why we are saying severity is moderate. 1%, I already said it, of those who are infected fall seriously ill. As I said before, that number varies primarily in accordance with age groups, as well as gender and a few other factors. So in a country with high median age, let's say in Europe, this figure will not be 1%, it will be something like 3%. Also, yeah. So that number, I mean, that whereas in a country where you have very low median age, let's say in many countries in Africa, for example, this number will be much less than 1%. Yeah? So keep in mind, these are global average figures. So for you individually, if you want to know about your country, that country will not be average, right? It will either be higher or lower, depending on which country. And also for you as an individual person, it all depends on your age, your gender, and other factors. And so these are just global averages, but that's what I'm interested in. And as said before, of those 1% who get severely ill, between 10 and 20% of those actually die in conjunction with COVID. Right? That's the so-called infection fatality ratio. Okay, we know all of this already. I just wanted to repeat it for those who didn't watch my earlier videos. just updating you on how are we tracking towards that 100% penetration that I just described. And as you can see, what the model says is we are now at 43% globally. As I said before, my model excludes China, which is, of course, a big chunk of population, 1.4 billion out of the total of 7.8 billion. The reason I explained before in depth, the reason I exclude China is because there's no data available. And China is too big to just sort of average it into the model, right? It's such a big proportion of the global population. Whatever assumption I would make, it would skew the model in a way that that wouldn't help, because it would make the model less credible. So my choice, what I thought was the most credible choice, was to simply say I don't know anything about China, and therefore I just exclude it from the model. Yeah. So when I say global, I mean the world except China. So I'm talking about not 7.8 billion people. I'm talking about 6.4 billion people as my base. Right? That's the global population, China being excluded. Okay, so of those 6.4 billion people, 43%, according to my model, have been infected. And if you look at my projection for the end of the year, so by the end of this year, about 50%, about half of the global population, China excluded, will have been infected. Yeah. So if you recall, we talked about herd immunity being something 60 to 70, or some people say 70 to 80% penetration, let's say 70%. We are well on our way globally towards herd immunity. Now, that is a global statement, again, differs by country. Some countries, I will show you later, are already very close to it, and other countries are very far away from it. Okay, so yeah, 43% of 64 billion, that's roughly 2.7 billion cases. My model, I explained the formula before, I will not repeat myself, but it is driven, among other things, or actually the two key drivers are mortality, excess mortality. So I'm not using the reported death figures, or rather I am using them, but then I'm scaling them up in accordance with what I know for a few key countries, what the excess mortality this year seems to be. So it's excess mortality, and then IFR. So I use IFR to then calculate the number of infections. So the 2.7 billion cases that I'm calculating, that's a calculated number. The observed, reported, let's say reported number of cases, according to Worldometer, is about 64 million. This is as of 1st of December. Yeah. 64 million are reported. I calculate that they're 2.7 billion. So that's 42 times as many as are reported. We talked about this before. The reported numbers are just the tip of the iceberg. Very few people on average globally get tested. In some countries, there's a lot more testing than in others. So those countries that do a lot of testing, obviously their reported figures get a little bit closer to the actual, whereas countries which do very little testing, their figures are very far away from the actual. But on average, it's 42 times the multiplier. The CDC in the United States 2 months ago made a similar assessment just for the United States, and they said the factor there was 10. And that's plausible and in line with my model. So in Europe, it's slightly less than 10, but in a country like India, it may be 50 or 60, and in some African countries, it may be 100, this factor, or more. I mean, there are some countries that hardly do any testing. That doesn't mean they don't have cases. They do, and they just don't test for them, so they cannot report them. And some countries test but don't report. Okay, so the CDC said in the US it's a factor of 10. So if I think today they are probably at near 15 million, if I'm not wrong. the reported number of cases in the US, 15 million. So according to the CDC, the actual figure would be 150 million or so, which is, about 40% or so of the population. So the US is quite roughly in line with this global average. Yeah. So when you hear people repeat it almost daily that the US is the most affected country in the world or so, that is not so, right? They are probably slightly below my global average in terms of their infection level, but they're very close to the average. So they're average. They are not more affected than many other countries. They are just more transparent. They actually report what they know. The CDC in the US, I have to give them credit. I think of all the national agencies that I'm aware of, and of course I cannot track all of them, but from what I see, the CDC in the US is probably the most transparent and updated of all of these national agencies that are in charge of tracking these things. So no, the US is not the most affected country. In fact, more and more, the world is quite uniformly affected, right? Because the initial starting conditions are different. It started in Wuhan, then maybe the second strain maybe started in Italy, and then, of course, it then depends on how connected is your country with Italy and how many movements, and so some countries get the virus a bit earlier and some get it a little later. Of course, the starting positions are not all the same. In the early stage, you have quite a diversity of, in some countries, and not only by country, but by location, right? Within a country, you can have some locations which have, some kind of massive outbreak because there is some super spreader event or whatnot, and the next location may not, right? So you have this huge diversity of initial states across the world. And then, of course, you have a huge diversity of policies. And so, which have some effect, at least in the short term, right? So, of course, in the early stage, there's a huge diversity in terms of where the different countries stand. And as I will show you, there's still a huge diversity, and it doesn't fully go away. But in principle, if there wasn't all this human intervention, this diverse human intervention that is different in every country or locality, the virus would spread more and more homogeneously. Right. So the idea is, some countries are more affected than others, is on a very basic level is nonsense. Right? The virus does not distinguish between countries. It affects between human beings, other than maybe by age, by gender, maybe by blood group. There are some measurable differences, but the virus doesn't distinguish where you are in the world and what passport you carry, right? And it doesn't know national borders, right? Unless those borders are then locked up, right? But that's a human intervention. That's got nothing to do with the virus. So, in other words, the idea that some countries are more affected than others is on a basic level is nonsense. We are all in this together as humanity, right? And the virus is global, and humanity, even though our nation states try to pretend it's otherwise, humanity is also global. Right? We are genetically the same. So all countries are, in that sense, fundamentally equally affected. Right? So so the US is being one of the biggest countries, having a significant weight in the model, not as much weight as India, but after India, it's the second biggest in the model by population. The model is scaled by population. Unsurprisingly, both India and the US are somewhere near the global average, right? Otherwise, if the biggest countries aren't somewhere near the global average, you probably wouldn't get that global average. Right? So, but it's good to see the CDC, doing some similar thinking to myself. Then I don't feel quite so lonely sometimes. Okay, so two things I wanted to mention here in the blue boxes. As we are moving towards herd immunity, this curve that at the moment looks, fairly straight line, almost linear, yeah, but it will taper off, right? Eventually, when we reach 70%, let's say, it will start tapering off, right? And it will not reach 100%. Probably for years. Once the vaccines are there, as I said, they protect you for a while. Some people will get a second round of vaccination, etc. So it will then ever more slowly sort of approach the 100% limit, but it will not reach it, at least not for a while. And I will at some point probably stop tracking this. So you will not see me showing, oh, we've hit 100%. That will probably not happen, right? But we'll be 70%, and then we'll start tapering off from there. The other thing to note is that these yellow stars here, these are actual data points from actual serological surveys. And you may have noticed as of November, there have been no more data points here. I've stopped tracking whether anybody is still doing. First of all, observation is I think not many people are doing serological surveys now anymore. And second, even if they did, I don't bother to look them up. I mean, the last one I checked was on Delhi. Delhi does a monthly one, and they may well have done one this month, but I didn't even bother to check. Even already in October, the data in October that they published, they acknowledged that they now had so many people who had earlier been infected but no longer showing antibodies that it skewed the data, right? And in fact, they showed in Delhi that the penetration, instead of going up, it had been 33% the months before. Instead of going up, it went down. And what I then did in that month of September here, in October, where you see Delhi 37.5%, if you see that on the yellow star up there. What I did was I took the data that I spoke about previously that was found in Germany that suggests that within about 5 months or so of the infection, 30 to 40% of those who were infected no longer show antibodies, right? So it only takes 5 months or so for 30 to 40% already no longer showing antibodies. So I used that data to scale Delhi to what it probably is. So, that calculation got me to 37.5%. But it's already then, making another level of assumptions about what exactly is that rate of diminishing antibodies in your blood, right? And we don't have very much good data about what that rate is exactly. So my building that additional assumption into the model just makes the model even more iffy, right? Any such model is always iffy, right? And the more assumptions you have to build in, the more sources of misjudgment or error you build in. So I just decided it's not worth me looking up what does Delhi say this month and then trying to scale it based on some assumptions as to how quickly those antibodies disappear from the blood, right? I just said that's A, too much work, and B, it doesn't add any value, it just adds another layer of assumptions and probably doesn't get you to any kind of very different results anyways. So I've stopped tracking serological surveys, and I believe there are probably not many being done anymore for that reason, right? Because the researchers realize it was very useful in the early stage, but increasingly now, it's you could track it, and you could also then try to identify how that curve looks that describes how quickly we lose antibody or no longer show antibodies, or what's the antibody count on day 1 after the infection, and then first it goes up, right, because you start producing antibody, and then it starts going down. And what's that curve? I think that would be interesting. And maybe someone will eventually want to know that, because, for example, for the vaccinations, you will have to figure out how frequently do you have to be re-vaccinated if you really want to protect yourself against infection. So you would need to have a view as to what is that curve, right? So I think the experts in the medical research, they will reconstruct that curve. But for my purpose, that's one step too far. I'm not going to do their work for them. So eventually you'll probably know what that curve is. And if you have that curve, you could build it into the model and it would drive your projections, or even your tracking here. But I'm just not going to do that. So at the moment, I'm just extrapolating my model based on what I learned earlier. Yeah, in terms of IFR and excess mortalities. You know, the excess mortality is a similar problem. For most countries that I'm tracking, the data is from 19th of June, published by the BBC. There's no second source, so I can't even be sure that the data is reliable. Plus, it's now already 6 months old data, right? And most countries do not publish excess mortality figures very often. Some countries do not at all. Those countries that I'm tracking, they all do. At least there is some data, but they may then in the new year, maybe in February, March, they may say, okay, we're now publishing the excess mortality for 2020. You know, presumably a lot of countries will try to do that because they're all curious to see what actually happened in 2020, right? But they can only do that a few months into next year, so that doesn't help us in the short term. So I'm explaining all of this just to make sure that you understand there are, as in any such model, there are a lot of assumptions built in. And the accuracy, I cannot vouch for. I can only tell you I'm doing my best. Right? I'm thinking about it and I'm trying to do my best. One thing that's pretty certain, I think, my numbers are much closer to the truth than the reported cases. Right? The reported cases are just reported cases. They don't tell you very much at all about the actual propagation of the virus. Right? So whether you quite trust my numbers or not, they're more relevant, they're more indicative of what's really happening than the reported cases. So if you belong to those people who every morning, first thing in the morning they do is check on Worldometer, oh, how many cases did we have yesterday? It's quite irrelevant how many cases we had yesterday. Yeah, not fully irrelevant because at least the movement you can track. Oh, it's going up or down. That, even that is hazardous because testing strategies change, right? But we've talked about all of that. But yeah, you can track, okay, the movements you can track, but the absolute level is completely meaningless. The absolute level of infection is way higher. No matter how you look at it, is way higher than the reported cases. Okay. I've added one chart that I didn't show before because you may have thought, well, Matthias, you're sharing your assessment or your modeling of the infections. How about the death? I have spoken about my model in terms of fatalities before, but I didn't display it last time, I think. So here's a chart to show you what I'm tracking in terms of fatalities. So as of today, according to my model, 5.8 million people have died in conjunction with SARS-CoV-2, or let's say COVID-19. And I'm projecting at current trend, and this is always very iffy because I'm just taking the 7-day moving average and project it forward, okay? That's all it is. But on that projection, 6.7 or so million people will have died in conjunction with COVID in the calendar year 2020. So come 1st of January, when I give you my next update, at this moment, I'm projecting 6.7 or so million people will have died. The number my model comes up with is about 3.9 times higher than the reported fatalities. Reported fatalities are certainly much closer to the actual figure than the reported cases, naturally, because whenever someone dies in almost all countries, there's some procedures to registering the death, right? Someone will write a death certificate, etc. Not everywhere. Not everybody gets a death certificate. I would be curious to know how many people actually die and don't get a death certificate. In some countries, that number may be quite high, actually. But by and large, deaths are typically tracked, right? So there's a pretty high accuracy in most countries in terms of fatalities, right? However, then, how are these fatalities registered? That depends. Usually a death certificate will have some kind of a cause of death or something like that, right? Now, what do people write there? First of all, if you didn't, let's say you have someone in hospital who has this typical COVID symptoms, but basically he or she has a pneumonia, basically. If you have the testing capacity, you would probably go and test, right? You might have already done that when the person entered hospital as a diagnostic, right? But if you haven't, by the time the person passes away, If you had the possibility to test, you would probably do that, right? Because person died of pneumonia, so pretty high chance that it could have been COVID related. So let me check for that, right? So you would do the test. And if the person was infected with SARS-CoV-2, you would say, okay, I report person was infected with SARS-CoV-2, probably died in conjunction with COVID, right? Because the combination of yes, having tested positive, and yes, having shown all those typical symptoms of COVID. Now, the problem is they are not typical. Right? The symptoms of COVID are the same as other severe pneumonias caused by other germs, right? That's the problem, right? So, but just looking at the symptoms, you can't say this is COVID related, right? But if you have the combination of, the person tested positive for the virus and they have those symptoms, then, pretty high likelihood that the person died in conjunction with COVID. And, so then you kind of say, I think that's a COVID death, right? But then what? Then what you write in your death certificate depends on how the government or the regulator or whoever is in charge of this structures the death certificate, right? If, for example, they say, what's the immediate cause of death? You might have to write sepsis or organ failure. There's no word of COVID there because COVID doesn't actually really kill, right? Well, COVID kills, but the immediate cause of death is something like an organ failure or so, right? I'm no expert on this, so bear with me on this. But it is so. It depends on what the form actually requires you to, to indicate, right? So in some countries, and this may be different by country. So in some countries, you may be encouraged wherever possible. So this is COVID, this is COVID. And in some countries, you may not, I don't mean to say the government actively necessarily discourages you, but I'm just saying that the way the form is structured may just not have a logical place where to put, this is COVID related. I'm making this up, by the way. I've not looked at these forms. I'm just thinking about it from a distance. This is all plausible. This could happen. Whether it actually does happen, I cannot vouch for. And again, there's so many different countries having probably different procedures, different forms, different ways of registering, different ways of aggregating the data, and different ways of reporting the data. No two countries are the same or comparable even in this respect, right? So cross-country comparisons, therefore, anyways, tricky, as I said before. But it's it's very plausible because of these things that either someone dies, but it could have been COVID but wasn't tested, so we don't know. Or yes, they were tested, positive, looks very much like COVID, but immediate cause of death is sepsis, and then it's not reported as a COVID death. You see? So even if the person has a death certificate, and even if they had tested positive and they had the right symptoms, and everything indicates that this is related to COVID, nevertheless, the way it's reported may not say that. All of these things. So what I'm saying is there's a yield loss at every stage, right? At the level of someone dies and maybe there's no death certificate being issued. Maybe there's a death certificate, but the person was never tested, so COVID doesn't come into the picture. Maybe the person was tested and was positive, but there is no, on the form or in the reporting system, there is nowhere to really clearly indicate that this is a COVID death, right? Because the system asks not, is this a COVID death? The system asks, is this, what's the immediate cause of death? And then your answer is something else, right? And so on. And then there's a reporting and the aggregation process. And then there's a question what the governments want you to know, right? I talked about this before, and this is one reason I don't include China, is because some countries don't report what they know, right? So they know more than they tell us. Right? So all of these factors, now China is not in the model, but there are other countries, Thailand, for example, copying the Chinese way of reporting, meaning not reporting. So this figure is very clearly, this reported fatality is very clearly underestimating, not overestimating, although that could, in a few cases, could potentially happen. But it's very systematically underreporting the actual fatalities, right? So if I say, well, the actual fatalities are probably almost 4 times higher than reported, I don't think that's entirely implausible. right? And again, I am using excess mortality with a simplifying assumption that all excess mortality is, by my definition, COVID related. That is a bit of a very conservative assumption because you say, yeah, some of them will probably be related to something else, right? COVID isn't the only thing that's happening in the world. Right? If you have some local outbreak of some other thing somewhere, then that could also drive excess fatalities in that locality, right? So one would have to, strictly speaking, I would have to normalize for all of that. But I just don't have that data, and it would be way too much work to do. So take the 5.8 million as a conservative, meaning it's on the high side of there's probably a range, and this is at the high side of the range, right? So if we are lucky, the actual fatalities are not quite as high as what I'm saying here, right? So this is a conservative assumption. Okay. There are a couple of kinks in my curve, and you may ask why. Well, between August and September, it seems to jump up the numbers, but that's just because I got some new data from India that indicated that fatalities and cases in India were actually higher than I had previously assumed. So there was some real data coming in that actually made me raise the numbers for India. And since India is the biggest single country in my model, that just then lifts up the entire, the total number. And then in November, December, I think you do have a bit of an effect from the common cold season in the Northern Hemisphere. It does affect, especially Europe and North America, but you can also see, Turkey, Iran, so Central Asian countries clearly also have this seasonality. Even places like Japan, they also have a winter, right? China certainly does, but again, China, we don't know. And a few other places, even places like Mexico, where you may think, isn't that quite a hot country? But it's not tropical, except maybe the Yucatan Peninsula, which is probably tropical. But the rest of Mexico is not a tropical zone. And if you are outside the tropical zone, again, I'm not expert on this, but I think then you may already have that seasonality, right? So Mexico is also experiencing that seasonality, for example, right? And Northern Africa, so the countries bordering the Mediterranean, they are experiencing seasonality as well. So if you're a certain distance from the equator, and or if you're basically either not a tropical country or maybe a desert climate, where anyways not many people live, everybody else has a seasonality, right? And the majority of people live on the Northern Hemisphere, not on the Southern Hemisphere. So right now, the vast majority of those people who are not in the tropical zone are experiencing seasonality, right? And that drives up fatalities. Okay. So why am I saying the global response has been ineffective? I've talked at length about it last time. I just want to really update you on one chart that I showed before. Remember, I said that country strategies have been very divergent, and I tried to just sort of bucket them to try to sort of make sense of, structure it a little bit, which of course is quite subjective. But you recall I had 4 buckets: normal countries, back to normal countries, muddle through countries, and new normal countries. So how I call them. In the first category, there's only one country that I'm tracking, that's Sweden. Why am I saying Sweden is normal? Because Sweden has behaved like a normal country. They have very much limited the impositions on their public and have relied on individual citizens to behave responsibly. Now they are also experiencing winter season right now, and the government has announced some restrictions in Sweden, and they are obviously now saying, with the vaccines coming closer, maybe now is a good time to minimize, fatalities, because within a few months, we would then have the vaccines, right? So let's get through this season, without too many fatalities. So you can see there is a bit of an adjustment to their strategy, but they're doing it very gently and carefully, thoughtfully. So the underlying principle in Sweden has been, we by the government, we can handle this situation without breaking all the laws, or suspending the laws, and without creating what I call a state of exception, without terrorizing our people. And I think that has not gone away. And that's why Sweden is perhaps the only country, sadly, that is normal. You might say, well, if there's only 1 out of 200 that is normal, then Matthias, you should rename it. That's unnormal, then the others are normal. No, I don't want to go there. I think what Sweden does is what you would have expected any, let's say at least any democratic country to do. Now then there are a whole bunch of countries that I call back to normal. I've added a few countries to my list because I do have some relevant data for them, and they are interesting and they are biggish. Mexico, South Africa, and Russia, and South Korea. Those I've added and bucketed, right? So the back to normal countries are countries that early in the, when SARS-CoV-2 sort of started to proliferate in March, April, had some significant impositions, measures, lockdowns. India, for example, had a very heavy-handed lockdown that certainly did more damage than good, for sure. But these are countries, let's say, they have a certain ability to learn. They realized that these lockdowns, national lockdowns, really are nonsense, right? We've talked about that many times. So these countries still may be using some measures, but it's measured. And it's recognizing that we have to live with the virus anyways. There's no point trying to suppress the virus to the hilt, right? It just delays the inevitable. That's not necessarily a good thing, this delay. Some people may say, yeah, but doesn't that save lives? Well, first of all, it doesn't save lives. It just maybe delays death. If that's what these people mean, I think that's what they probably mean. Yeah, so yeah, it may delay death, but it does also a lot of harm to a lot of different things in society. And we've talked about that, so I don't need to repeat that. So these countries, by and large, and then of course I'm imposing a view here from the outside. I haven't interviewed them and said, what are you actually thinking, right? It's just an outside view based on the data that I'm saying. These countries apparently say, well, by and large, we let the virus run. We have measures, but their measures aren't so heavy-handed. And our objective is really to get back to normal as quickly as possible, right? So get through this fast without overstretching our healthcare system and without hopefully too many fatalities. But that's sort of the mental image I think I impose, if you like, onto this category. And you have diverse countries from US to Brazil to Mexico. You have South Africa here, and I use South Africa almost as exemplary for all of Africa, or at least sub-Saharan Africa. You have Iran, which is the biggest country in the sort of Central Asia region. You have India, which is the biggest of all, and then Indonesia, which is the biggest in Southeast Asia, and similar to the Philippines, Myanmar. So these are big, important countries that quite representative of many other countries. So that's probably the biggest bucket by far in terms of population. And what you see there is that many of them are approaching 70% penetration already, right? And most of them are not that far away. Then the muddle through countries, mostly European countries. I call them muddle through because I just can't figure out whether they have a strategy at all. And they do lockdown, then a opening up, then the micromanagement, then a lockdown again. And this is, I call it the yo-yo effect, right? I spoke about that. So now they are back into winter lockdowns. You would have thought they had learned from the first round of lockdowns that it's useless, but they haven't, right? So they cannot decide whether they want to terrorize groups of people, travelers, skiers, or whatnot, or whether they should not, right? Do we have human rights or do we not have human rights? I think these countries just can't figure it out, right? They look helpless. Now, Russia may be a bit different. Russia, it's difficult to tell. I don't read Russian, so I don't follow their media. But in terms of their just the numbers that I'm calculating, Russia maybe in that bracket. Russia may also be in the back to normal bracket instead, but again, it's very subjective anyways. And then you have lastly the new normal countries, mostly in Asia Pacific. These are countries where apparently governments actively embrace what they call the new normal, by which they basically mean high degrees of disciplining people, high degrees of impositions on their individual rights, if they have individual rights. In some countries, of course, people don't really have any rights at all. But where they have rights, such as in Japan or Korea, either a heavy imposition or, more interestingly, because they're so-called collectivist, the government doesn't have to impose because the people will just do it, because if government says we all have to wear masks, they all wear a mask. Could never happen in the back to normal kind of countries, right? But in these countries, this is what I call collectivist, or last time I talked about them as the Confucian world or so. They have a certain collectivist mentality where the government doesn't even have to pass a law or regulation. They will just say, okay, everybody has to wear a mask, and then everybody wears a mask. Or everybody has to stay home, everybody stays home. So very high, call it very high compliance, and therefore not even necessarily the need for heavy imposition. Right? The muddle-through countries are countries where the compliance isn't so high, and the government think therefore we must pass laws and send out the police and control the streets. Right? In the new normal countries, you don't even really need to send out the police to control the streets because the citizens do it anyways. Right? So it's a different mentality, different mental sort of model of life to some degree, right? And I mean, humans are diverse, so that's just recognizing the fact. And societies, humans are the same, but societies are diverse. Let's put it this way. So these new normal countries, they have a strategy to suppress, right? For them, their key performance indicator for the government officials is, zero new local community transmissions. That's sort of their KPI, right? And that's what they're gearing their systems again. They're using technology. They're using either heavy or gentle, but ideological guidance. Let's put it this way, for the population, to get them to behave in a way that is consistent with very slow transmissions. And as a result, you have slow transmissions. And which means if there was no vaccine, these countries would need decades. They would take decades to get out of this, right? They would be in this new normal for decades. And that's the strategy. Now, the government there will, of course, all say, well, but we know the vaccine is coming, and as soon as the vaccine comes, we will be vindicated because we will have fewer fatalities than those other countries. That's what they will say. But of course, until about a month ago, we didn't know whether the vaccines were coming. They do seem to be coming, so yeah. But it's interesting that quite a number of countries that you can see here on the right have only a few months now, runtime, until they reach 70% infection rates, according to my model, right? Mostly those are back to normal countries, of course. The UK is one of them, though, and France is currently also going rapidly that way. But both of them have imposed lockdowns, and so, they will probably slow down again. UK was probably initially in the back to normal bracket, but after the Prime Minister himself had an infection and actually got apparently significantly ill, needed breathing aid, though not mechanical breathing aid, not a ventilator. He wasn't put on a ventilator. But so when he came out, I think he had changed his perspective, and since then the UK has become a muddle-through country. Before it was a back to normal country. So countries can change tack, but most countries, by and large, once they had set their mind on a strategy, whether explicit or implicit, they tend to stick to that strategy. So there's not a lot of learning, unfortunately, learning would mean, they pivot, right? They try new things, but they don't. They all believe they have the ideal approach, which of course, by definition, cannot be the case. You cannot have 200 countries all having an ideal approach if everyone has a different approach, right? so none of them have the ideal approach, right? But they all think they do. Well, Sweden probably, I would argue, is closest to an ideal approach. Now, yeah, look at Sweden. It's interesting. So Sweden, if you take Sweden as the normal, meaning the virus is allowed to proliferate relatively without significant impositions, but with a populace that is alert, that is educated, and that takes responsibility for social distancing within limits, right? So where there's a good balance, if you like, between, we want to have a normal life, but we also recognize that this virus can lead to COVID, and COVID can lead to death, right? So a balanced perspective on this situation. If you take that perspective, and now Sweden isn't representative of the world, it's not a very densely populated country, so the people there anyway. Social distancing is part of their, they don't get as close physically as, for example, people along the Mediterranean coast who tend to hug and kiss, and not trying to propagate stereotypes here, but I think there's some truth in that people behave differently in terms of social distancing, right? And Scandinavians generally have probably a higher social distancing standard than people in the Mediterranean, right? Even in Germany, you can see that Northern Germans tend to be a bit more distant than Southern Germans. So, and that, in a way helps the Swedes, right? It makes it easier to keep social distancing without any kind of strict impositions, because people just naturally are inclined to do that. So I wouldn't say that Sweden can be representative of the world, but it can be a model to emulate, even if you cannot copy it, but you can emulate. So, so what you get is, if you are like Sweden, is it does take the virus quite some time to get through, so to speak, the population to get to 70%. So we've now had, what, nine months, and current projection for Sweden is it will bar the vaccine, right? If there was no vaccine, it would take 28 more months to reach herd immunity. Now in Sweden right now, the figures are going up. So this is a snapshot. So in a month's time, maybe that 28 months have become 20 months, right? Because it is always a projection based on whatever happened in the last 7 days or so. So this projection is always wrong. And if in Sweden now the numbers are still going up, then you would expect that next time we talk, the 28 months will have become something less than that, maybe 20 or so, or 22, right? But no, take that together, take 9, let's say we've had 9 months already, or now it's almost 10. Let's say 25, 20, let's say 26, it's good to calculate, 26 more to come in Sweden, 10 plus 26, 36 months divided by 12, 3 years. So and this is very rough and ready, but the virus, if you behave normally, if governments do not think that they are smarter than they are, which all governments probably do, and you just allow nature to take its course, but you are not negligent, you protect your most at-risk population, and you protect your healthcare system, but you also build your healthcare system, you invest in it. If you do the right thing, if you had a rational strategy, and Sweden, I argue, comes closest. It wasn't perfect at all. In the early stage, they had a lot of excess fatalities in old folks' homes that were avoidable because they made some very significant tactical errors, and they've admitted as much, right? So Sweden isn't perfect, but they made an error and then they fixed it, and they are not repeating that error. You see, they are able to learn, and that part really didn't work, right? So, anyway, so if you behave like a rational country, and Sweden, in my view, is closest to that. Now, I'm not tracking 200 countries, I'm just tracking a dozen. So bear with me. I mean, if you say, oh, but there are some other countries that seem to be very, I don't really know, right? I don't know all 200 countries what exactly they're doing, right? But of the countries I'm tracking, and they sort of tend to be the biggest countries or the countries that have something unique. And I love to track China, but I just can't because there's no data. Of those countries, Sweden, I would say, is the one that stands out for having a rational approach to this. So therefore, what I'm saying is, and recognizing that Sweden is not representative in terms of population density and education levels and healthcare system and many other factors, nevertheless, my observation is at the moment that, and I had this observation already in March, so that's why I'm quite keen to repeat it now, as we are getting towards the end of this year. It takes about 3 years, and that was exactly my projection in March. My very first model was, saying it looks like it may take 3 years to get to herd immunity. And Sweden, if I take that as the representative normal case, seems to bear that out. It takes something like 3 years for this virus to propagate through the population. Clearly, it will differ by country, by region, by climate, by many other factors, but that seems to be a good benchmark, right? It takes the virus 3 years to run through. Now, some countries are much quicker, as I said, and of course, the vaccine now will shortcut that, right? So if you vaccinate someone, that's the equivalent of that person having been infected. So if you do mass vaccinations, those people, you accelerate the path to herd immunity, right? I will talk later about vaccination strategies. Hopefully, the sort of the rational countries will focus on vaccinating those people who are at risk. The UK has announced that what they're doing. That's good. Means you don't have to vaccinate everybody, right? You have to vaccinate maybe 20 to 30% of your population, or if you're in Africa, probably 5 to 10% of the population, because Africa, many countries, you have very few people at risk. So you get through that. If you want, you can get through that vaccination program quick. It's very effective. And no, you don't have to get everybody else vaccinated just so that you have herd immunity, right? Because that herd immunity will then just naturally happen anyways. It just takes a little bit longer than vaccinations, right? But no, it's not necessary to vaccinate those people. Now, if you choose to vaccinate people who want to be vaccinated, sure. If you have the stuff available, if it's if it's free, and people say I want it, sure. But it's not really necessary, right? Naturally, we'll get to herd immunity. It just takes, on the whole, 3 years, and we are now 1 year into that, let's say. So two more years to go. With vaccinations accelerating that, maybe 1 more year to go, right? So maybe by the end of next year, we'll say pretty much every country, almost every country has reached herd immunity. Whereas if you didn't have the vaccine, then, as I say, Japan or Korea would take decades. These are more than 100 months, right? 1 year has 12 months, so this is like 10 years at least. But the vaccines, will accelerate that, and then for the rest of the population that didn't get vaccinated because they didn't really have to be vaccinated, it will take some time. But most countries, maybe by the end of next year, will have reached herd immunity, thanks to the vaccinations. And without the vaccinations, it would be fewer. Right? But as you can see, quite a lot of countries are making rapid progress towards herd immunity. Right? The implication of all this, the reason I'm saying the global response has been ineffective and that's a problem, is what you've created artificially through those vastly different strategies and policies is a vastly divergent dependency on vaccines. Some countries almost don't need the vaccines anymore. It's not quite true. I mean, even places like Iran, Africa, Mexico, if they can vaccinate the people at risk who have not yet been infected, and there's still a lot of those, then that's good. They shall do so, right? So every country benefits from the vaccine, but some countries depend on it to get back to some semblance of normal much more than others. Some countries really don't depend very much on the vaccine at all. They will get there pretty soon anyways, according to my figures. Other countries wouldn't get there for a decade if they didn't have the vaccine. So very diverse dependency on the vaccine, and that could be a recipe for trouble if the vaccines turn out to be scarce. But the other thing that clearly emerges from this is that we should expect vastly divergent travel and immigration rules for some time. We're not going to go back to the quasi-globalized model we had until last year, where, yes, for many countries you still needed a visa. Many citizens of many countries needed a visa for almost anywhere they wanted to go. You can imagine that I'm a strict opponent to any kind of visa. Any human being should be able to travel anywhere on this planet where they want, without any restrictions. That's my view, and you may think that's radical, but I think that's not at all radical. That's natural. Any human being has a right to move around. So I'm strictly against any kind of border immigration and passports. And yeah, we should have a registration each of us. That's fine, but there should be no restriction on visa requirements. Visa regimes should just simply go away, in my view. But obviously, what's happened this year is we've gone back. We've not moved forward on that. We've gone back to countries imposing new restrictions on everybody, right? And so what you will see is that some countries that feel like they're through this, by and large, they will start opening up and they will allow people to travel again, but other countries will not. And so you'll have a complex world in the next year or 2 or 3, even, or some of these new normal governments, they may never go back to where they were before, right? They will literally remain in that new normal. And that new normal may encompass much more difficulties traveling between countries, much more barriers put into your way. Do you have a vaccination certificate, right? China already proposed that last week, that only people should be allowed to travel who can demonstrate that they have been vaccinated, right? I mean, that is very scary, right? I mean, we may... the aftermath of this harmless virus and our overreaction to it may be that we will be much more restricted in our rights, and that we're not going back to normal, and that some countries will force the rest of the other countries to be in some kind of new normal, right? Because if you travel between countries, it takes a bilateral agreement that you can travel between those countries. And if one of the 2 countries says no, then the other country can't do anything. Yeah? So expect, for people who like to be free, there are difficult times ahead. I promised you an update on this chart. I said last time that countries that allow the virus to proliferate relatively freely over the summer, these are all Northern Hemisphere countries, over the summer would plausibly, and this is just a question of logic, have less of a bump up during the season, the winter season, right? And those countries that suppress the virus even in the summer where it's naturally anyway suppressed, it self-suppresses, right? But they hammered on top of that during the summer, and then gave themselves a clap on the shoulder. Oh, we are so good at controlling this virus. No, the climate does that for you. All of these terror attacks on travelers who had to go into quarantines and weren't allowed to travel, and completely nonsensical, right? Because the numbers, I mean, I'm talking about Northern Hemisphere countries, this is like Europe, for example, and the numbers would have been low no matter what, right? So completely unnecessary hammering down on certain groups of people, with the effect that numbers were so low, therefore penetration remained very low through all summer. And then, of course, then as soon as the winter comes, you have this, what I call the yo-yo effect, right? And the numbers bear that out. In Sweden and the US on the left, currently the winter activity so far, this is fatalities, is 1.3 times higher than the summer activity. And whereas on the right in France and Germany, it's 20 or 25 times higher, right? So it's a very different factor. Now you could say, yeah, but it doesn't mean that France and Germany at least delayed some fatalities. So people might have died in the summer, at least they gave them another 3 months and they're now dying in winter. Yeah, there's some delay of fatalities, that's true. But at a cost, which is you're running again against the limits of your healthcare system, right? And your healthcare system, what happened is that during the summer, people said, we are everything under control. So all these intensive station beds were released to normal other patients, right? And occupied by other patients, not non-COVID patients again, which is good in a way. But now all of a sudden you're scarce again. You're not prepared for this onslaught of new severe cases. Fatalities are, a leading indicator, if you like, or a lagging indicator of severe cases, right? So in France and Germany, the number of severe cases has gone up by 20 or 25 times, whereas in Sweden and in the US, it went up by 1.3 times. That's the difference in terms of handling the situation. So again, in Europe, we have a lockdown. It became almost, I guess, inevitable in the view of those short-sighted politicians. Yeah. And again, they're running up against the capacity limits, right? That was entirely avoidable, is my argument, right? You may say, yeah, but wait, Sweden just has high numbers in summer because they had those excess fatalities that would have been avoidable. So don't give them credit for the mistake they made earlier. Yeah, that's true. The numbers should have been lower. And if the numbers there, in the early part of summer had been lower, then of course now the multiple would be higher. That's true. I can't jig the numbers now, right? But this is what the numbers say. Here I'm using the recorded fatalities, right? Because I haven't got the timeline like this for my calculated fatalities. But it's okay because all of these countries, their excess mortality ratios are similar anyway, so it doesn't make a big difference to my argument. But so you might rightly say, well, but Sweden is skewed. They had too many fatalities in summer, and therefore now their ratio doesn't look so high. That's true. That's true, but it's also true that you can see the slope in Sweden is they didn't hammer down on it. If you have a hammering, then it falls off more steeply. Whereas in Sweden, it gently tapered off. So you basically just, in Sweden, mistakes have been made, as I said, but that apart, it's basically just you see the tail end of the last winter activity, right? And since fatalities have a time lag of 4 to 6 weeks, probably closer to 6 weeks than to 4, but somewhere in that range, a lot of this is really the tail end of the the last winter season, right? So this is a natural progression, except the whole level is too high. If they had avoided those mistakes with old folks' homes and care homes, then the whole level would be lower. But the shape of the curve is, if you like, the natural shape of the curve, right? And then in summer, naturally, the activity is lower, but see, Sweden has some activity. They didn't hammer down on that little bit of natural activity, whereas France and Germany did. Right? US is yet another maybe special case. Yes, they had just generally fairly high numbers throughout the summer, partially maybe because it's a big and diverse country in terms of climate zones, and some states just really started having heavy activity later than others. So you have a funny kind of distribution. It almost looks like several countries overlaid on top of each other. That's why the US curve is a bit complicated. And you may say, yeah, but that's not very representative, and da da da. But I think no matter which countries you pick for this analysis, where you have data, you always get to the same conclusion, which is countries that allowed the virus to proliferate in the summer are now better off in winter. Why? Because they don't have to add so much capacity to what they already were using. So their system runs more organically, whereas in France and Germany, it's inorganic. You have to, all of a sudden you have to ramp up again, and you scramble. And so you get on the BBC, you get all these people again talking about how terrible the situation is in the UK. How terrible, and again we're in this situation, and you go like, yeah, but people, we knew that would happen. That's the result of your policy. You made it so, right? That's the point of this chart, right? If we are now seeing lockdowns again in some European countries, and if you're now seeing again capacity bottlenecks in the healthcare system, it is because we made it so. policymakers made it so. I showed you last time I sent Frau Merkel a letter on, when was it, 10th of June or so, saying the winter's coming and here's how you should prepare for it. She didn't. Yeah, we didn't need any of these lockdowns. Man-made, self-created problems where there didn't have to be that problem. I'm not saying the situation in Sweden or US is easy. I'm just saying it's easier. That the virus is seasonal, that's a fact of life, right? And we have to deal with it, right? But that we knew that it would be seasonal and therefore could have prepared for that, that has to be said, right? Although, why can't I breathe? Maybe you know Don Quixote, famous novel. Don Quixote is an elderly Spanish lesser nobleman, sits at home, not much to do, reads novels about medieval knights. You know, think about King Arthur and the Arthurian legends and the likes. They were very popular in Europe in the 13th, 14th century, and Cervantes, the author of Don Quixote, makes fun about it. He makes fun about a lot of things. Don Quixote, Cervantes, sorry. Don Quixote sits at home in his armchair, reads, you know, medieval stories of medieval errant knights, and imagines himself becoming himself an errant knight, even though he lives at a time where, you know, errant knights no longer really existed. So, but you know, it's in his imagination that world comes alive again, and so he gets on his horse. He gets a helper on a donkey, and the two of them, you know, ride out into the land to slay dragons and to save maidens from evil, etc. And one of the first adventures, and one of the most famous adventures, is they encounter a bunch of windmills. And if you go to La Mancha in Spain, where this is set today, you still see these types of windmills, right? And Don Quixote, you know, imagines these windmills to be giants. You know, and the blades of the windmills are like moving arms, right? And so he takes a spear and lets his horse pounce onto this giant, and he pierces one arm of the giant. Unfortunately, there's a bit of wind, and the windmill goes around, and it lifts. These are big windmills. It lifts him up, as you can see here on the right, and smashes him on the ground. And so he's quite severely injured from that first adventure. So Don Quixote fighting windmills, and these are famous illustrations by Gustave Doré, famous illustrator. And they're hilarious, right? So yeah, so I was imagining our, oh, and the word Quixotic, of course, in English is derived from Don Quixote, right? Quixotic means something like crazily idealistic or crazily fantasizing or something like that, right? And so I'm saying the reason I can't breathe is because our governments for 9 months now have been imagining, you know, corona windmills and going to war against windmills. And in the process, taking away our liberties and basically our normal lives. That is very disturbing. The most disturbing part is that they don't seem to be able to learn, or they don't want to. I mean, at the beginning, you might have said, yeah, it takes some time to understand the virus and what's going on. But no, you know, we've had plenty of time to understand the virus. But they don't want to understand the virus, or they understand the virus very well, but they don't behave accordingly. They use the opportunity for whatever their own motives are. Why can't I breathe? Because it starts with the definition of what's going on. By the most common definition, there is no pandemic. A pandemic is, and this is just the first one that pops up in the English and in Google or so. I mean, there are a few definitions, they vary, but they're not all that different. So according to Merriam-Webster, a pandemic is a disease that affects, that occurs over a wide geographic area and affects an exceptionally high proportion of the population, right? A disease, for consistency, I looked up the definition and also Merriam-Webster, a disease is defined as a condition that impairs normal functioning and is typically manifested by distinguishing signs and symptoms. Now, first of all, observation, it's not clear that COVID has distinguishing signs and symptoms. In my view, which is a layman's view, those are when you have severe COVID, you basically have a pneumonia in most cases anyways. And the pneumonia is a pneumonia. So these aren't distinguished signs and symptoms, they are undistinguished. In other words, there's no such thing as COVID. I said that before, there's pneumonia. So there's a question I asked last time, is whether even the disease COVID as such exists. I mean, we've named it, but I'm asking the experts, well, does this disease deserve its own name? Is it distinct? Or is it just pneumonia, which already has a name? Now, I don't know what the scientific name of pneumonia is, and maybe there are many kinds of, scientifically, maybe many kinds of pneumonia. Maybe the experts will say, no, Matthias, yes, it's pneumonia, but it's a specific type. It has some significant differences from others, and therefore it warrants to have its own name. In our taxonomy, as medical experts, this makes sense, and I would, of course, immediately accept that. I'm not trying to argue with the experts about the taxonomy, really, but as a layperson, I'm asking, first of all, is there even a disease that is distinct? Personally, I don't think so. I think this is pneumonia, so this is not distinct. Any severe pneumonia has these symptoms and is potentially fatal, especially for elderly. That's nothing new. Nothing distinct. So that's the first observation, that maybe there is not even a disease here. I mean, a distinct disease, right? There's a disease, for sure, but it's not a new or novel or distinct disease. That's one issue. The other issue is that it doesn't affect a exceptionally high proportion of the population, not at all. I defined, and you could argue with my definition, but I defined disease or equated disease with severe symptoms that require hospitalization. That's a choice. You might say that's too narrow a definition of disease, right? Not every disease necessarily has to require hospitalization, right? Where does something, a phenomenon like a headache or common cold kind of symptoms, where does it start being a disease, right? That, you can probably argue about that forever, but in my definition that I'm using, disease really means you're really ill and you really need treatment. That's disease, right? And as I said, in our assessment, 1% of the global population, 1% of those who are infected actually get sick, severely sick, in a meaningful way sick, right? 1%. That's not an exceptionally high proportion of the population. That's an exceptionally low proportion of the population, not exceptionally low. I mean, out of 7.8 billion people, that means 78 million get severely sick, right? And up to 15 million or so die, right? That's still, in absolute numbers, it's not at all trivial, right? But proportionally, given that we have a huge human population on this planet, proportionally, this is not an exceptionally high proportion of the population by any stretch of the imagination. So I'm arguing neither is there a disease, nor, I mean, a distinct disease. There is a pneumonia, yes. We have a heightened number of cases of pneumonia in the world right now, for sure. Significantly heightened, for sure. But it's not an outbreak of a disease if a disease is defined as something that has distinguishing signs and symptoms. But even if you say no, but it is even if it's not a new disease, it is an outbreak of pneumonia, Matthias. Okay, then I would say fine. Then the second part is that I say, yeah, but it's not affecting a high proportion of the population, right? So there is no pandemic. And I'm not saying this as a joke. I'm saying this because I'm saying there is no pandemic. And virtually every politician on this planet is telling us virtually every day there's a pandemic, there's a pandemic, there's a pandemic. Not by this definition. Right? So maybe the definition is just wrong, you may say, but I think it's quite a plausible definition. All of us get infected, but the point I keep honing in on, and you know that already, infection doesn't mean disease. 100% of us will get infected, only 1% of us will get diseased. And that difference is a real profound and fundamental difference. And if you don't make that difference, then everything you do is confused. And I'm arguing that's what the governments are doing. They're all confused. Yeah? They don't understand the difference between an infection and a disease. Or they don't want to understand. Just a moment. Okay, point made. Are we at war with nature? Tedros Adhanom, Director General of the World Health Organization in March said, we are at war with a virus that threatens to tear us apart if we let it. He's virtually encouraging us to go to war with the virus. Virus is part of nature. I hope you can agree on that. So he is encouraging us to go to war with nature. And he says the reason is because otherwise nature will tear us apart. I mean, that's two incredibly nonsensical propositions packed into a single short sentence. That's quite an art. I mean, that's quite an art. First of all, no, we are not at war with nature, and we cannot possibly be at war with nature because we are part of nature. No, nature doesn't threaten to tear us apart. Ourselves, us humans, our policies are tearing us apart, not the virus. The virus doesn't do anything like that. So, I mean, Mr. Tedros has just understood absolutely nothing. And yes, this was in March, but there has been no sign of improvement. He is completely and utterly ignorant of what's happening in the world. It's you know, that's probably why he is in this job, right? Yeah, I think incompetence always helps, right? So okay, so that's what he said. Now his boss, Antonio Guterres, who is the Secretary General of the United Nations, the other day said, sort of the other way around, humanity is waging a war on nature, and he was referring to so-called climate change, right? This is suicidal. So he is warning against, so Tedros said, we must go to war with nature. His boss says, I'm warning of us being at war with nature, right? So his boss saying the opposite. But the point here is that it's just the language both of them use, and I have more personal sympathies for Guterres than I do for Tedros. I have to be very honest here. But nevertheless, I disagree with Mr. Guterres just as much as with Tedros when it comes to the language they use. Right? Let's stop talking about wars with nature. Right? That is a nonsensical concept. I mean, the best way to start thinking about the world is to think of ourselves as part of nature. Right? If you just start from there, then everything else falls in place. It is not in our interest, therefore, obviously, to destroy nature. It is not even in our interest to destroy this virus. 8% of our DNA, some experts say, is of viral origin. 8% is a lot, right? That's the difference between a human and a mouse, or even something lesser than that. 8% of the entire DNA, that's a lot, right? Which means we would not exist as human beings if there wasn't viruses that serve as a transport, a transfer mechanism of fragments of DNA, right? So-called crane is what philosophers of nature call this, right? A crane. It lifts evolution up. Virus is the crane. But without viruses, the world would be a very different place and we would not be here. So I think it is a little bit useful sometimes to have a bit of the humility to acknowledge we're part of nature and thank God, right? And what flows from that is very clear. Let's not destroy anything that is natural. I mean, yes, we have a tendency to want to impose our lifestyle on the world around us, and that's a human thing, that's human nature, but there are limits to that, right? If you just start recognizing that, then everything else is actually really quite easy, right? And if we recognize that, we wouldn't be now fighting windmills, right? Coronavirus windmills, right? And I fear that the so-called climate change will be the next windmill. Now, of course, it is man-made. I agree with that. The current increase in temperatures of the last 50 years that we're observing is, in all likelihood, man-made. I concur with that. Right? However, that doesn't mean that we're at war. Right? Yes, we are maybe at war with ourselves, but humans can be at war with humans, so we cannot be at war with nature. And we, just on that point, before we go and again restrict our individual liberties and rights and again undermine our democracies because of some elusive war that we are fighting, let's be a bit cautious. Let's not start again discriminating people. I mean, this summer it was travelers, this winter it's skiers, and this in the future with so-called climate change, I can already anticipate how people who like to eat meat will be discriminated, or people who like to be mobile, travel will be discriminated. How dare you go on a flight? We are human beings, we have rights. Right? And I can already anticipate that with climate change, more than with coronavirus, again and again, the rights will be pounded upon. And Guterres will be one of those people doing the pounding. Yeah, it's just completely the wrong approach. If we don't even know whether climate change is bad, for whom? For some people, it may be good, depending on where you are. Maybe if you're a Pacific Islander, you said that's very bad because the water levels may rise, right? But if you're a Siberian hunter, maybe you say, oh, cool, there will be more game to hunt, in the future when it gets warmer. I don't know, right? I'm making this up, but it's not so easy, right? Everybody can agree that yes, temperature is going up. We have a statistic, and it's unlikely that that's a natural effect. It could be a natural effect, but it's not very likely. More likely, it's a human-made effect, CO2 into the atmosphere, etc. The mechanisms are understood. Yeah. So there's a global warming going on, and it's man-made. I think we can all reasonable people can agree on that. But the next step then to say, therefore, we must fight the war. That's the wrong step. We don't even have a rudimentary understanding of what this climate change means. Now, some people may say, oh, but we cannot wait, we don't have time to think, we have to act now. That's exactly the same mistake again that we made earlier this year in respect of coronavirus, right? Instead of thinking a little bit, act, and it doesn't matter that the action is all wrong and counterproductive and kills a lot of people. we acted, right? That's what politicians do. And again, I don't mean to just hammer those poor politicians. They're just our representatives. And they have majorities behind them in many cases. So it's the majorities of the populations who want this to happen. Why? Because they are not thinking. Right? And that's, when I see these statements, that's what comes to my mind. Here are people, and I mean both of them, even though they're saying something quite different, they're using the same concepts, waging war on nature. I think the first step will have to be to think about the way we think and how we name things, right? Let's not call out a pandemic, Mr. Tedros, if there's no pandemic. Because once you call out a pandemic, all hell breaks out. Yeah? Because all governments then think they have the right to impose a state of exception on the country and suspend laws and suspend rights, just because, someone said, Mr. Tedros said there's a pandemic. let's be very cautious with how we name things, right? We are talking about climate change at the moment. First of all, it's temperature change. Yeah, no, temperature change, the climate experts may say, yeah, but if you have a temperature change, it will affect other things in the climate. I buy that, yeah. But we have to be really clear about what are those changes, and then what implications would those changes have in the future. And not all of those implications are negative, probably. Yeah? I would ask the question, for example, do we have any evidence from the fossil records that in hotter periods of, over the last many millions, hundreds of millions of years, that in hotter periods, there was more biodiversity on this planet, or there was more biomass, purely quantitatively speaking, more biomass on this planet? My hypothesis would be both might be the case, that generally warmer temperatures may be conducive to proliferation of life. We need to take a standpoint that is not just the human standpoint. We need to work with Nietzsche, who says perspectivism, right? You look at the situation from different angles. Yeah? Not only through your narrow glasses like these ones, but you look at it from a different angle. How about from the angle of other creatures with whom we share this planet, right? On so on, right? I don't mean to solve this problem here now, but my worry is that what I learned from this mini crisis this year, and it's really no crisis, but this sort of mini man-made crisis, is that there's always this risk, apparently, that we just rush into some actions without having thought through it. And if we do that with climate change, it could be devastating. I mean, there seem to be people out there who just desperately want to get to some kind of new normal again, right? A new normal where maybe humans are no longer humans. Yes, because humans do produce, that we use energy and we produce waste, right? Or don't call it waste. I mean, we are actually just recycling chemical substances. That's all we do. We are a recycling machine, right? Something goes in and something comes out, right? That is not bad or good. That's neutral, right? So I think we need to understand the problem before we take massive actions. And this year with coronavirus, we just simply did not follow that simple rule. We acted without thinking. People neither care or nor think about what's really going on. It's my contention, right? When I say they don't care, let me tell you what I mean by that. If you look up the statistics, you will see that last year about 60 million people died of all causes worldwide, right? It's a bit less than 60, but I like round numbers here, just for ease of arithmetic, okay? So 60 million, let's say, is an annual normal rate of fatalities in the world, which means about 160,000 per day, just to give you a figure, right? Now, you may not have known that. I guess you didn't know that. How come you didn't know that? I can tell you why you didn't know that, because you didn't care. I didn't care either. I mean, I didn't know this until I checked it up, right? We don't actually care how many people die in the world every year. We don't. Let's be honest with ourselves, right? We don't. Of these 60 million, 20 to 30% die of infectious diseases or complications related to infectious diseases. There are different definitions, let's not get into the details, but rough number, 20 to 30% of humanity die in conjunction with infections. This is a low number. This is probably the lowest ever. 100 years ago, probably this figure would have been 80 or 90%. Almost all people died of infections. That was the most common cause of death. In the last 100 years, we've made a lot of progress when it comes to hygiene, medicines, vaccinations, antibiotics especially, right? So obviously infections are not only viruses, also can be bacteria, fungi, and other things, right? So bacteria are probably the most widespread, of course, but yeah. So all infections taken together, and we've had great progress in the world in terms of reducing fatalities from infections So 20 to 30% may sound high, but it's actually very low compared to historical data. Today, the most common causes of fatality are cancer or heart disease or such things, and not infections. But that's a very recent development. You know, for almost all of history, of human history, it will have been infections, right? So dying of an infectious disease is not anything unusual, right? In fact, it's the most usual thing that you could ever think of. Now, this year, more people will die of infectious diseases than last year. That's certainly the case. As I said, at least 6 million in my calculation will come on top. So instead of 20 to 30% of all fatalities being from infections, this year it will be 30 to 40%. That is a significant difference, no doubt. But you didn't know that, did you? You didn't know the 20 to 30%, so you couldn't, I mean, you didn't even know that it's 6 million because the public figures are 1.5 million, right? Much lower than my figures. So anyways, you don't know these numbers because you don't care. You don't actually really care how many people die every year in the world of infectious diseases, right? Let's say that very frankly, right? Maybe it's not politically correct to say that, but that's exactly why I say it, right? Because it has to be said. We don't care. If we cared, you know, in OECD countries, only 10% of all deaths are linked to infections. Meaning in the rest of the world, non-OECD, it's much higher, which means, at least in principle, a lot of these are avoidable. Because if OECD countries can avoid those fatalities from infections, if we applied the same, ultimately it's money, right? The same money to other countries, we could lower this ratio from 20 to 30% down to 10%. We could. We have the means. We have the scientific knowledge, et cetera, et cetera. We just would have to take some money into our hands and do it, right? And yeah, it would take some time. I mean, processes have to be established and training people and da-da-da-da, right? So it's not trivial, I know, but it's in principle totally doable. If we wanted to, we could reduce this number of 20 to 30% of all fatalities being from infections down to 10%. We have the means. We just don't do it. Why? Because we don't care. We don't actually care that fatalities from infections somewhere in Africa are so much higher. Right? Some of us care, of course. People in the health sector maybe care, or some people in charities care, but you know, most of us don't care. And that's my point. Right? So when we now all of a sudden pretend that we are so shocked, people use that a lot, that word, shocking, that people die of COVID. They're lying. It's a plain lie. They're not shocked. If they were really shocked, then they should be shocked all the time. It's not different dying of COVID than any other pneumonia. Yeah, of course, now we are seeing all these pictures of those poor people there in the hospital on a ventilator, and everybody, oh, 50% chances people could die. Yeah. I mean, those are real figures. I'm not disputing those figures, those pictures. The pictures are real, but they happen all the time. And normally we just don't look, right? Because we don't care. Okay, Germany, similarly, about 1 million people die per year, 10% of which die, according to publicly available data, 10% of them die of sepsis. Sepsis is an overreaction of the immune system to an infection. So that's the most common way of dying of an infection is by sepsis, okay? So it's a proxy for a death by infection, if you like, right? It's maybe not exactly the same definition, but you know, roughly. So in Germany, 10%, and that's not untypical for OECD countries, 10% of people die of basically infections, sepsis, of which the experts say another 20% would be avoidable. So if that is the case, then if the number we could achieve if we wanted to was 8% in Germany, and we could then translate that to the rest of the world, the whole world would have 8%. Instead, we have normally 20 to 30%. I'm just saying we could be saving lives, which is the mantra, right, that many people use. We could be saving lives all the time, but we don't. right? You don't. So let's not all of a sudden go berserk and go mad just because there is one more cause of infectious disease and fatalities. It's completely irrational. In Germany this year, I'm projecting 28,000 fatalities linked to COVID. Means we will be going from our typical 10% of people dying of sepsis to 12.6% of people dying of sepsis. Do you care? You didn't know it's 10%, no? If I told you it's 12.6%, you would have said, oh. If I told you it's 10%, you would have said, oh. If I tell you, well, this year we're going from 10% to 12.6%, should you know? No, you should say, okay. You didn't know those previous numbers anyways. You are not in a position to put it into perspective, right? And therefore, it's meaningless to say, oh, all of a sudden I'm so shocked. It's irrational. If you care about the welfare of humanity around the world, then don't start just now, right? Well, you may say it's always a good time to start, but yeah, don't overreact, okay? Yes, if you now, thanks to COVID, have become a better person and you care more about the welfare of the rest of the world, great, fantastic. I don't believe you. I don't believe you, sorry. People don't want to know what is the case, right? I already last time showed you the picture of BBC announcing President Trump test positive for COVID-19. And I said, I was laughing about it, right? It's no laughing matter, actually, right? You cannot possibly test positive for COVID-19. There's no test for COVID-19. There's a test for SARS-CoV-2, for a virus. COVID-19 is an illness. You can diagnose it. And part of the diagnostic process would be to do a PCR test for the virus, yes, but that's only part of the diagnostic. Right? You would look at the symptomatics and other things, right? So this is the BBC. They think they are like one of the leading broadcasting channels in the world, but they obviously are not able to distinguish between SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19, right? Between 100% and 1%. Right? That's shocking. Now I use the same language. That's really shocking. I mean, I knew media aren't very high quality anywhere, but this is really the low point reporting in my life, and I'm 55. I would not have imagined it could get this bad, right? And they keep repeating it every day, right? They just don't learn. Or Chancellor Merkel, I hadn't talked about this, but this is an amusing one, right? So on October 21st, the German health minister, ironically health minister, but Spahn, was diagnosed, not diagnosed, sorry, now I get confused myself, was tested positive for SARS-CoV-2, right? And, he said, I go into self-isolation because I tested positive. And Chancellor Merkel sent him an email or WhatsApp wishing him a speedy recovery. Now, this guy is 40 years of age, and there's virtually no chance that he would get severely ill, right? Virtually zero, right? And certainly by that moment where he informed everybody that he had been tested positive, certainly there's no suggestion anywhere, as far as I can see in the media, that he had any symptoms, right? So maybe he did have mild symptoms, but there was no talk about that. So Merkel wishing him a speedy recovery suggests she thinks he's ill. And that's exactly the problem. Right? It starts with that definition of pandemic. 99% of those people infected don't get ill. Yeah, I know I'm repeating myself, but it doesn't seem to get through. World Health Organization warning of last week, warning of an infodemic, and they say, oh, all this fake news. Now they are the biggest source of fake news about SARS-CoV-2 and about COVID-19 on this planet. How dare they? It's ridiculous. What happened in 2020? I said it before. Instead of 4, we now have 5 common cold coronaviruses. Take a rest, lean back, take it in. That's all that's happened this year. Instead of 4, we now have 5 common cold coronaviruses endemic to us. That's it. If we were rational, we would have said, okay, noted. Oh, some people seem to have difficulties with their immune systems. Oh, let's see how we can help them boost their immune systems. That is not enough. Oh, we're seeing people flocking into hospitals. Oh, these people need extra protection. How can we protect them? Oh, the most obvious. Oh, this is a virus that enters the body through the upper respiratory system. Oh, at least 98% of the cases, 99.9% of the cases probably. Oh, okay. Well, there's one obvious solution ready at hand that we've been using for decades. It's called a surgical mask, which is designed precisely to prevent viruses and other particles, bacteria as well, from entering into the upper respiratory system. That's precisely what they're designed for. And they've been in use for decades and they work. That's why they're in use, right? Especially in highly sensitive environments such as operating theaters, right? So we could have said, oh, okay, there's a new common coronavirus. Okay, it enters through the upper respiratory system. In a few cases, it gets down into the lung and makes us trouble. Those cases where that happens are almost invariably people above, let's say, 65, to say a number. Okay, so we need, and it's not enough to just help them boost the immune system, because it's not actually so easy to boost the immune system. You can take some vitamin D, but it's not going to make a big difference probably. So, okay, in the short term, yeah, we need to have treatments and we have to have vaccines. All good, absolutely, let's go. But in the meantime, while we're working on that, it seems like we have to mechanically protect these people, right, from inhaling the virus. And so let's distribute surgical masks to all people on this planet above 65, plus some people who have who are below 65 but have some prior conditions. We define that. A bit arbitrary, but you have to define something and then you go and do it. By April or May, we could have completed that operation at a cost of a few $1 billion or maybe a few tens of billions of dollars. And all the world, all the people in the world, with some exceptions, very, very remote places, we could have secured a reliable supply of surgical masks to people above 65 all over the world. By April or by May or by June. I mean, let's be realistic. It takes a bit of time to produce. Most of manufacturing in China, so China would have had to really ramp up their production. Maybe other countries go in and also do production, and then pool all of that and distribute it fairly, right? There could have been a role for the World Health Organization there, right? Simple scenario: what would have happened? Vast majority of the fatalities we've experienced, of those 6 million that I'm talking about, would have been avoided. Other than that, nothing would have happened. Our GDP this year would have been slightly higher than originally thought because of this additional investment into masks. And of course, we would also have invested into hospitals, especially ICUs and breathing machines and all the rest of it, PPE and whatnot. So our GDP this year would have been higher than anticipated. And other than that, for 99% of us, no, let's say for 80% of us, 20% of us would have to wear a mask on certain occasions. They wouldn't be forced to do that. They would have been encouraged to do that. And it would have been made as easy as possible for them to do that by sending the stuff literally to their house on a regular basis, for free, of course. And not all of them would have taken that up, right? It's their individual choice, right? They're adults, remember. But the majority of them would have done that. The rest of us would have had a completely normal life, no change at all. Maybe governments would have said, oh, we have this additional cost now, we need to raise some tax somewhere, or we need to collect some money, maybe charitable or whatever. As I say, a few tens of billions maybe would have been the investment required, right? Peanuts compared to what we've destroyed this year in terms of GDP, right? Peanuts. The richer countries could have funded it, right? No problem. Yeah, and we would have had far, far, far fewer fatalities, and we would have had no disruptions of our basic citizen rights and liberties, of our economy and of our regular life. None. That would have been a rational strategy. That's why our scenarios that we crafted in March, when we said remember the northeast quadrant, it's called early spring, a world in which the virus or the disease turns out to be moderately severe, and the global response is highly effective. We call that scenario early spring. There was a plausible scenario back in April and March when we crafted it, that within a few months, I think we were thinking maybe by July or so, that within a few months we would be back into that early spring scenario, meaning normal. We've done the right things, we've behaved rationally, the world has come together, addressed the problem, recognizing that the problem exists primarily for people above 65, We do the right things to protect these people. In parallel, we build our capacity because not all of them we can effectively protect, right? Because wearing a mask is tedious and sometimes they forget and sometimes they don't wear it properly, etc., etc. And by July, that was our thinking when we crafted those scenarios. By July, plausibly, we thought we could be back to normal. And what I'm telling you now is that was absolutely plausible. And it's still, in retrospect, plausible. We could have dealt with this effectively, with this so-called crisis. In fact, we could have said, there is no crisis. Calm down. There's a virus going around. It affects some people. We know the groups that are highly affected by it, age groups. We will protect those people. We do the right thing. We'll all collaborate on this in parallel. We'll develop treatments and vaccines. And that's it. That's it. That's all it took in terms of response to this virus. Instead, we have turned the entire world upside down. And we continue to do that every day. And people just don't seem to want to wake up from their little dream. They're all still like Don Quixote sitting in his armchair and dreaming of being an errant knight and fighting windmills. Now, what's very comical and funny in Cervantes is not at all funny in the real, okay? It's not at all funny. It's destroying the lives of 7.8 billion people. It's not funny. So what did we find out? Firstly, as I said, we found out that 1% of the world's population lives with immune systems that are so compromised, mostly because of age, that they can't handle a harmless, if new, the reason they have a problem is that it's new, not that it's harmful, but it's new, common cold virus. So that's an interesting new learning. We didn't know that before, right? Now we know that. That's interesting, right? Because if we look at the problem from that angle, let's forget about virus for a moment. Right? There are millions of types of viruses in the world, and sooner or later, the next one will jump over to us. It's inevitable, and it will happen ever more frequently. I explained that last time. Why? Because there are ever more of us, and we take up ever more biomass on this planet, and we push the rest of the biomass, to the corners. And since most viruses live not on us, but on other living matter, plants or animals, the more we destroy their habitats, the more they will jump over to us, right? It's inevitable because of our behavior. And secondly, we get ever older. And therefore, our immune systems will ever more become compromised and stretched, right? So this number, 1%, can only go up. So we've learned something here, and maybe it makes us think, right? We all want to get older, and it's great that we're able to get older and older, and often with a very good quality of life. That's fantastic. And I'm not saying we shouldn't. I'm just saying we should also be mindful that there is a cost and a risk associated with that aging. One of the risks is, well, the immune system isn't by nature made to last that long, right? And just like other organs start failing when you get older, so does the immune system, right? Let's be aware of that, and let's accept that as natural. As you get older, your immune system gets weaker. Let us not make the mistake to say we punish 99% of the population whose immune system is fine because 1% of us have a compromised immune system. That's a completely wrong response. That's completely unfair also. That's nothing to do with solidarity or the kind of stuff that some people talk about. That's just pure nonsense. You destroy the lives of 99% who have no problem with this virus because of those 1% who do. And I'm not blaming those 1%, of course, right? I have a mother who is, 84, and she's one of them, right? And maybe I will later on be 84 and be one of those people. So this is not about blaming, but it is about recognizing. It's about recognizing if we are facing a problem here, it's not a virus. The problem is not a virus. The problem is we're all getting older and older and older. We're having aging societies, and it comes with certain implications. And one of the implications is a certain percentage of the population will be ever more susceptible to infections by novel viruses, which are, as I said, ever more likely to jump over to us, given that we are expanding our biological footprint all the time. That's us doing that, not nature, right? Well, we are part of nature, as I said, but we are taking up a bigger share of nature, and it's got implications. And all I'm saying is we need to, be mindful of those implications. And if the next time, if a virus jumps over again, we know, okay, certain percentage of us, maybe by that time it will be 2%, will have a problem with this. Or maybe the virus is more, in some way, more aggressive. Then maybe it's not 2%, but maybe it's 20%. Could be, right? A certain proportion of the population will have a difficulty with that next virus. It's bound to happen. Right? We can already know that now, right? So let's not later on say, oh, shock. No, it's bound to happen, right? So is there things we can prepare? Yeah, I mean, one thing we learned this year that is positive is that we are actually able to produce apparently functioning and safe vaccines in a matter of less than a year. That's a great achievement. I mean, there's something positive coming out of this whole mess, right? Which is our progression in terms of treatment, understanding how to deal with these people, and especially with the vaccines. Right? It gives us hope that next time the next virus comes, we'll be quick. But there's no point, even while we are producing that new vaccine, if it takes a year, during that year to shut everybody down. It's nonsense. So we just have to respect that aging comes with certain liabilities. That's just the fact of life, and it affects all of us eventually, right? Some of us will be lucky and our immune system will be very robust, and others will be less lucky, but it's a lottery, right? So it's not about pointing fingers at certain people, but it's just making sure that we don't fix a very narrowly defined problem by shaking everything up. There's no point doing that. It doesn't do it's not effective, it's not efficient, it's often counterproductive. It's just plain stupid to do that. It seems what we learned is that an everyday natural occurrence, okay, it doesn't happen every day that a new virus jumps over, but I mean, we have over 200 common cold viruses. Presumably many of them came over from other mammals, right? Some of them we may have had even before we became humans. Our ancestor mammals already had them, and others may have jumped over to us after we sort of became human, right? And so this is normal. It's not every day, I admit, but irregular. It's a regular feature, and as I just said, it will increase in regularity. And it seems that just this kind of natural occurrence of a virus jumping over to us already is sufficient to undermine any semblance even of adherence to basic individual rights and freedoms. What I'm saying is, I had no idea how fragile these rights and freedoms are. I thought in a place like Germany, for example, where I'm from, there, thanks to the aftermath of World War II, thanks to the Allies really who brought this to Germany to some degree, rock solid. And I grew up in Germany and I thought this is a rock solid democracy, and we have solid rights and freedoms that cannot be shaken by any kind of government, no matter what political side they are on. And that confidence this year was profoundly shaken. In fact, it's gone. What I've learned is that any government, for any stupid reason, can take your rights and freedoms away, like that, without thinking. That is extraordinary. Or to put it in another way, governments that usually treat their people as adults now all of a sudden begin treating them like children. Like that. I tell you when you are allowed to go where at what time. Oh, you can take out the dog, but if you don't have the dog, you cannot go out. This is adults. Adults talking to adults. We've just redefined the meaning of adult, I think. We no longer have adults on this planet. So countries that usually treat their people like adults now all of a sudden treat them like children, and those countries that always treat their people like children, and there are countries like that, they now treat them like animals. They get attacked, like a dog. They get traced and tracked everywhere they move. It's like a herd of cattle, right? The only objective governments have is to keep them alive because they're valuable to them, right? Yeah, it doesn't matter which means they take to keep them alive, right? So maybe they will sell their people in the marketplace at some point. I don't know. No, these people are productive for the economy, and therefore they have to be kept alive, right? So that's basically like treating them like robots, right? Productive robots whose productivity should not be impaired. So that's the only objective some governments seem to have. But what's so surprising is that this step from treating someone like an adult to treating that same person like a child is a very, very small step indeed. It's a very thin line. That is amazing. Third observation is the nation state is dead. We already knew that at least since World War I, which demonstrated that the nation state is completely broken beyond repair. But it's still amazing after a century where we had some degree of what we call globalization and nation states becoming somewhat less important relative to other institutions, how quickly we've been back to nation state, right? Close the borders, boom. I mean, it's, I used this similar before, right? The lion, male or female, when they have a territory that they think is theirs and they want to claim it, they go, shh, right? They mark the territory, and within that markers, they say, this is mine, and if you trespass, you're in trouble, right? And that's exactly what our politicians did in March. Like, close the border so I have full control over this little piece of the world. I don't care about the rest of the world, but in this little piece of world, I have control. And that's all they wanted, control. That's what nation states are about, right? For a small bunch of people, politicians and their courtiers that surround them like flies, right? To have power and control. That's what it is about, right? And that system is back with a vengeance, thanks to a little virus. It's amazing, right? So I still think the nation state is dead and is putrefying. It's a putrefying cadaver, but it's got a long shadow. Speaking with Nietzsche, it's a long shadow that haunts us. And I think the bad news of what I learned this year is that this shadow of the nation state will prevent us addressing any future global challenges effectively. So if you have things like climate change on your agenda, do not even dream of these nation states fixing that if you think it's a problem, right? Assuming you do think it's a problem, and assuming you do think it needs to be fixed, forget it. I mean, that's one thing we've learned this year, right? That is, if they cannot even deal with a mini problem that is almost, there's actually no problem, but I mean, you could define it as a problem if you really, really push it. They can't even deal with that. If you think that climate change is a big problem, pray. Because the politicians of the leaders of nation states are not going to fix it. They are going to make it worse. That's the only thing they know how to do, is make things worse. I gave Frau Merkel sort of a school report in June, 3rd of June. I'm not going to linger on it. She got very bad grades. I translated into English and into ABCDE scale, ABCDEF, I should say. Red means a fail, ELF, and black means a pass. You can see there are actually more fails than passes. about a dozen subjects that I define. Now you could argue with my subjects and with my ratings. Let's not go there. I just want to tell you, if we do this exercise again. So in June I said, mostly fails, and lo and behold, by December it's the same picture. It's gotten slightly worse actually. The point of this is just one thing I want to make. There's no learning. And so far as the German government is concerned, they have not learned a thing. If I'm fair, I should say they have learned one thing. National lockdowns are catastrophic. At least we do our lockdowns locally, which I agree. If you have to do a lockdown at all, which I say you don't, right? Remember, I'm very clear, you shouldn't do any lockdowns anywhere. But if you want to do a lockdown, local is better than global, yes. Because the problem is always, or the outbreak is always local, right? This is completely pointless to do a national lockdown because in one little town there's a carnival session and some people got infected, right? Which is what we did in March. So they've learned one thing, which is do the nonsense we are doing not on a national level, do it on the local level. So decentralized nonsense instead of centralized nonsense. Yeah. That's the only improvement. So it's very sad. I had sent Frau Merkel a long letter, sent her my comments to the grades, and then also prescription advice as to here's what you could consider doing to improve your performance in class. She's done nothing of that, right? Well, probably she hasn't read my letters, right? She has like 3 layers of people between her and my letters. So my letters don't pass the first hurdle, probably. I understand that, and that I respect. I mean, I have a right to send letters to her, and she has a right not to read them. Right? That I grant her, right? But you have to get your advice somewhere, right? I don't think Frau Merkel got any good advice from anyone. That brings me to my next chart, actually, which is here's my global scorecard, right? End of year grades, global. Oh, who are the winners? Coronavirus, of course. That's the big winner. It's turned out to be just about the smartest thing on this planet, It acts completely rationally, completely in line with natural laws. It does what's best, not only for it, but actually for the world. And it's just a fantastic little thing. I've learned a lot about viruses this year, and I have to say I have a great deal of respect for viruses now. Unfortunately, the flip side is I have lost a lot of respect for humanity this year. The losers are us humans. I love this little cartoon here. Go back, we're fucked up. We fucked up. Yes, we fucked up this year and we are on the way back, right? We are going into retro evolution, closing down our brains, becoming, I don't know, apes again. Among the winners, among the politicians, the winners are Stefan Löfven, the Swedish Prime Minister, more so even Anders Tenger, his chief advisor, who is one of the few people who understood the situation early on and have acted accordingly, or advised accordingly. And Mr. Löfven, the prime minister, was smart enough to take good advice. So his winning formula, and why is he a winner? Because he chose an advisor who can actually think. That's a pretty cool and rare thing in politics. And listen to him, right? And Xi Jinping is a winner because he also understood the virus very early on. I last time talked about how he went to Wuhan on the 10th of March and looked at the situation, and he understood. What he understood is that you can fool most people all the time. He understood that. Remember, there's this saying, you can fool all people for some time and some people for all the time. He understood that's not quite right. You can fool almost everybody almost all the time. He understood that, and that's a winning formula for a politician, right? I mean, who wants to have power and has ambitious aspirations for global, I don't know, for global leadership. Let's put it this way. So he's a winner. Trump is a loser. He lost his election. It's ironic. He's one of the few significant politicians who actually said something really reasonable about the situation. Remember, he came out of hospital. I mean, they put him into hospital even though he didn't need hospitalization, but for VIP treatment, they put him into hospital just in case after he got tested positive. He said, don't be afraid of COVID. Don't let it dominate your life. That's one of the most rational statements of any politician in this entire year. Right? But he forgot, never say the truth as a politician. My God, Trump, what did you do? What were you thinking? You say the truth? I mean, he obviously didn't understand the rules of the game, right? So that's why he wasn't elected again, because the majority of Americans didn't want to hear that truth. You know, they wanted to hear wear masks, you know, we'll all be whatever Biden has been preaching, right? That's what the majority of voters wanted to hear. And Trump, he didn't understand that you cannot just simply speak your mind, right? So, sorry, great guy, but bad politician. And Merkel, big loser, because she, unlike her Swedish colleague, she did not either have any advisors who can think, or she didn't listen to them. So among the organizations, you know, Sweden is the obvious winner. I mean, Sweden in Europe is the beacon of democracy and of human rights now, and it's the only one. I mean, without Sweden, basically Europe would now be in the dark ages, right? And the other one, maybe you would be surprised to hear that, but I think the US is the clear winner. Because the United States and her people, the American people, have reasserted what they are all about, what makes America great. It's called freedom. Freedom is what makes America great. Freedom is what brought all these millions and millions of immigrants to America, and still does today. Right? Freedom. And by and large, with some variations on state levels, whether they're Democratic or Republican and so on, but by and large, America has followed its strong intuition of maintaining freedom. And I laud the American people for that. And I congratulate them, as well as the Swedes, for this achievement. At least there are two countries, and there may be a few others, to be fair, but I'm just not tracking them. But, you know, there may be a few countries, and, you know, some Latin American countries maybe would fit in here as well, holding up the beacon of democracy and freedom. The losers, of course, the European Union, it's become irrelevant. I think we can probably, unfortunately, close it down. Now with the vaccine, at least the European agency in charge of vaccines is given a role. That's good. Also in the later stage, since the summer, countries have by and large tried to keep the borders open among the members, which is, by the way, required by law, right? Or by acquis, by legally binding contracts. All the countries broke these legally binding contracts earlier this year, but they have tried to go back to something resembling a common market. A common market not just for goods, but for people. Right? So maybe it's not quite dead yet, the European Union, but almost. The World Health Organization is dead. I would agree with Trump on this. Let's close it down. It's hopeless, right? You could not have had more incompetence in one place, in a situation where really they could have made a positive contribution. Let's just close them down. I don't think they can be resurrected. I think there is no chance. So, end of year quiz. Remember, state of exception, A or B? Hygiene, ideology, emergency law, suspension of parliament, restriction of free movement, restriction of freedom of speech, and discrimination of minorities. Seen that before? Yes. Where have you seen that before? A, Germany, 1933. Remember, that's when Hitler seized power. B, Germany, 2020. Dun, 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 dun. You're right, both. Sadly, I've learned one more thing this year, which I've been really chewing on for much of my adult life. I'm interested in German history, and I studied the history of the 30s and 40s somewhat closely. I'm not a deep expert, but I'm interested in it. And the one thing I could never quite understand is how the German people, the majority, could go along with someone like Hitler and the things he said. I mean, you read his book, Mein Kampf, that was written in the 20s and then published maybe in the late 20s, which has basically his ideology pretty much mapped out. It's terribly written. He's not a good writer, but for historical reasons, it's an interesting read. And a lot of the stuff that he actually later then tried to execute on is in the book, right? And not just, I mean, many people don't read books, but he spoke about many of these things before he came to power. Right? Maybe he was quite clever and cautious, depending on who he was talking to, how he was talking about it. I mean, like a good politician, right? But nevertheless, I mean, it was obvious. It must have been obvious that the guy is a completely madman, right? He's talking about an Aryan race that doesn't exist. That he said is a pure race, but it has been polluted. I don't know by Jews and gypsies and communists and some other people he didn't like, and it has to be cleansed. It has to be purified of these impurities, right? I mean, he said that in his book. And the Germans are the master race, or the Aryans are the master race, and these Slav people to the east, they are the under race, and we are born to dominate them and turn them into our slaves, right? I mean, he wrote all of that in his book. So maybe people, when they voted for him, thought, oh, that's just he doesn't mean it, right? But yeah, he meant it. He didn't only write mad things; he actually wanted to do mad things, right? And I never quite understood how people were on average quite educated, quite well read, quite cultivated. They thought, I mean, Germany at the time, they thought of themselves as among the most advanced nations on this planet or something like that. And how could they fall for this kind of nonsense? And yeah, now I know. Because the same thing happened again this year. A completely nonsensical hygiene ideology. Virus is bad, we have to keep them at a distance, you have to suppress them, they should not enter us. It's just as nonsensical as to say that there's an Aryan race that it has to be purified. It's complete nonsense. And the majority of Germans buy this. And they are cultivated and educated and they well read and they think of themselves as one of the most advanced nations on earth. Déjà vu. Yeah, so thank you, coronavirus. You have taught me a history lesson. I now understand how Germany or any nation could fall for nonsense. And the interesting thing is, people outside Germany especially, were arguing that, oh, this could only happen in Germany because of certain circumstances, would not have happened in other countries. Now we know that's not the case either, right? Because this time around, this nonsense was bought by almost all people around the world, not everywhere, but at least in Europe. So in retrospect, I would say probably almost any nation in Germany could have fallen for someone like Hitler. Because it's not about Hitler. And it's not about that particular ideology. People fall for an ideology if they want to. That's what we are learning, right? They just simply fall for an ideology without thinking. And it cannot really be rationally explained, I think. It's just sort of something that we just have to accept as given, that this is human nature, apparently, that we sometimes choose to fall for some nonsensical ideology. And we just did it again this year. What next? Last time I spoke at length about immune system, very high efficacy. Then I spoke about surgical masks being an ideal way to protect the elderly. Pretty high efficacy if they wear them, and if they wear them properly, meaning cover nose and mouth, right, properly. If properly worn, highly effective. If you layer that effectiveness on top of the immune system's effectiveness, you get a very high degree of protection already. No need for others around you to wear the mask. Of course, if you visit your grandma and you say, I want to, as a gesture, I want to, also wear a mask when I visit her. Okay, you're welcome to do that, right? But it's not strictly necessary because the increment is small. And in fact, if you visit your grandma, you probably don't want her to wear a mask either at your home, right? So the best, actually, as I said last time, is not to wear a mask for you, but to get a test done just before you visit, right? And if you happen to be positive at that time, maybe you just postpone your visit by 10 days, right? And that's it, right? So, or 14 days if you want. So I said last time, the way to protect the elderly around them is to people who have regular contact with them, could just then really test themselves regularly, like the staff in old folks' homes, for example. They should really have access to testing on a regular basis, right? That probably would make sense, Or, the children who occasionally visit the grandma, they may really consider having a test done before they visit. I mean, that is rational, I think. Other than that, all it takes is for the elderly, when they go out, wear a mask and, high degree of protection. Now, vaccines, by the looks of it, will have a high degree of protection as well. Great, even higher than the mask for sure, because, mask you don't always wear properly, et cetera, et cetera. Some stuff gets through and so on. So vaccines will be great when we have them. And yes, we don't know the long-term negative effects, if any, but hopefully they will be zero. And there's no plausible reason to assume that the vaccine is more dangerous than the virus itself, because it mimics the virus. So it's unlikely that the vaccine actually causes more long-term harm than if you were to be infected by the virus itself. So people who make that argument, I don't know where, I shouldn't take the vaccine because I don't know the long-term effect. Yeah, but you don't know the long-term effects of the virus either. So to expose yourself, if you're at risk anyway, if you think you're at risk, to expose yourself to the virus is still a riskier proposition than to expose yourself to the vaccine, I would say. So if you're an at-risk group and you want the vaccine, take it. Now, however, governments, having told us a myth about a pandemic, they're almost forced to now tell a myth about the vaccines. The myth being only the vaccines can save us, right? Because if they don't do that, they would be inconsistent and people would start pointing out, well, maybe it wasn't as bad as you told us because now you're not so aggressive on the vaccination. So therefore the governments have no choice now, unless they want to end up in front of the judges in the court for crimes against humanity, they now have to insist that the vaccines are the greatest thing on earth and the only thing that can save us. And that, we can't open up before we have the vaccines. And many politicians even saying, no, we have to have 80 or 90% of the population vaccinated, which is nonsense, but they are saying that because they're protecting the earlier nonsense, right? Having done the earlier nonsense, you now almost have no other choice but to, continue with the nonsense. And down the second wave of nonsense is, all of us have to be vaccinated, right? So while people will have pandemic fatigue or resentment because they have been told so many things, in the summer they have been terrorized when they wanted to travel. Now in the winter they are terrorized if they want to go skiing or want to go anywhere. In fact, even if they want to just have a Christmas with their family, they're being terrorized, right? So yeah, of course, if governments hammer all the time, the hammering makes the, the surface that they're hammering on eventually pretty fatigued. Yeah, surprise. In some countries, in surveys, less than 50% of people wanting the vaccine. Yeah, of course, it's very rational because only 20 or 30% max of the population actually need the vaccine, so they're perfectly rational. But in some countries, they're already being vilified. Oh, these people who don't want to take the vaccine, they're destroying the whole thing. No, they're just actually thinking. But if you are an unthinking government, then any thinking person, of course, is trouble. Yeah, sure. Vaccines becoming mandatory, maybe not de jure in most countries. In some countries, probably de jure. But in most countries, governments say, no, we don't make it mandatory. But if you don't have a vaccination certificate, you can't go there, and you can't do this, and you can't travel. So de facto, it will become mandatory. Anybody who wants to get sort of their normal mobility back will have to get vaccinated, right? Which means, if you remember the scenarios for the COVID, for the vaccination that I presented last time, number 4 now doesn't look very likely. Number 4 was, what if we don't get a vaccine anytime soon? That doesn't look likely now. I mean, there's 3 vaccines now where we think we have good likelihood that they all will get approved from multiple major agencies and therefore can be distributed, etc. So we will have vaccines. So number 4 now looks very unlikely. So let's put that aside. Now, number 1, 2, and 3 are all plausible. Number 1 was the most optimistic scenario where we say if all governments agree that all it takes is to vaccinate only those who are at risk, meaning let's say 65 and higher, plus a few special cases, people with prior conditions, etc. So let's say 20 to 30% of the population, then we could be through that vaccination. And if the world collaborates and makes sure it's evenly distributed, etc., etc., the logistics have been put in place, the cold chain and all that, we could still, I think, in theory, be back in early spring by July. If all governments agreed that all it takes is to vaccinate those at risk. It's, however, on the other extreme, it's also possible that, number 3, that distribution battles occur, either between countries or even within countries, because it takes time to get the vaccines. And if government do things such as, oh, if you've been vaccinated, you're then allowed to do X, Y, Z. Those who haven't been vaccinated are not allowed to do X, Y, Z, for example, travel, right? If you have those mechanisms, then you may get even conflict within a civil society, because everybody will then be elbowing their way towards that vaccine because they want to get back to normal, right? So government policy may still push us deeper into the fractured world. That's possible. But in my view is the most likely scenario is number 2. Some countries will aim to vaccinate the entire population and not only at risk cohorts. Some countries will not do that, like Britain right now, that first of all we go for those most at risk. But whether Britain then, even if they, let's say in 3 to 6 months' time, they have vaccinated all of those, whether they then go back to normal, I'm not sure either, right? Even there, they may say, oh, now we do the second round and all the others, right? Before we go back to normal, right? So we don't know which country exactly will do what, but my hunch is that a lot of countries will not go back to normal until the vast majority of their people have been vaccinated, even though most people don't need the vaccination, as I said. Most of us don't actually need the vaccination. We'll just get it to do our governments a favor so they can do us a favor, going back to normal. It's some kind of like a circular logic, like it's a drunk logic. But that's, I think, what's most likely to happen. And so in July, 6 months from now, we'll still be in exactly the same place where we are today. We'll not be able to travel freely. We'll not be able to move freely. We'll still be in positions on our daily lives, just like today. That's unfortunately, I'm afraid, the most likely scenario. Now, if we say, how about December 2021, 12 months from now? Possibly a lot of countries by that time will have gotten through vaccinating their populations, and the governments, in their strange logic, will then say, now everything is okay again. Now we can go back to normal, right? So maybe by the end of next year, at least some parts of the world will have a semblance of normality. With that thought, I wish you a Merry Christmas. If you celebrate Christmas, beautiful masks under your Christmas tree, and lots of toilet paper rolls. And if you don't like those items, I agree with you, maybe there are nicer things to give to your loved ones. So enjoy, take care.